All right, let's take a look at the Indianapolis Colts and see what did they do during the 2018 offseason. What did they do to try to improve their roster after that rough year last season without Andrew Luck? Well, one thing they did was they fired their coach. Chuck Pagano is gone. Frank Reich, who was the offensive coordinator for the Eagles, is in. So that's one of the biggest changes. But there are a lot of changes to the roster, and we're going to break those down for you right now. But first, let's look at the cap situation. At the beginning of the offseason, the Colts had $76 million in cap space. That was not the highest, but it was among the highest in the NFL. So they had a lot of cap space to work with. Since then, they have spent quite a bit of money, but still have $51 million in cap space remaining. So they were fairly conservative in free agency. The GM there is trying to build the team through the draft, which is the way that you want to build a team. And so let's see, what did they do in the draft? But before we do that, let's take a look and see who were the players that might have been at risk of getting cut to increase that cap space even further. The one person that I had on my radar, and I'm not saying they were a guaranteed cut by any means, okay, but I thought John Simon was at risk of being cut. I'm not saying I thought he was definitely going to be cut, because he played really, really well before he got injured. But at the same time, he was scheduled to make $3.2 million this year. He's going to make $4 million next year. There would have been no dead money. So I thought, here's a guy that maybe, they're not desperate for cap room, obviously. So, it makes sense to me that they didn't cut him. He got 3 sacks in 9 games, 4 tackles for a loss, 43. So, he was doing really, really well. It does not surprise me that they did not let him go, but he was a guy I thought was at risk of being let go. In terms of their free agents from last season, who were some of the key free agents that they had? Frank Gore. That was maybe the biggest name that they had in free agency. You can see most of his numbers there on the screen. Last year, it got cut off at the bottom of the screen, but he had 961 yards rushing, plus 245 yards receiving. You can see that since 2006, the guy's had 1,000 yards rushing every year except for 3. Okay, in 2010, he missed 5 games, only had 853 yards rushing, but did have 452 yards receiving, so he still had 1,000 yards from scrimmage. In 2015, his numbers dropped off there, had 967 yards rushing, a career low of 3.7 yards per carry. But once again, still had 267 yards receiving, another 1,000 yards from scrimmage. And then last season, he had 961 yards in 16 games. Once again, had 3.7 yards per carry. So, these are really some of the lowest numbers of his career, but once again, had 1,000 yards from scrimmage. So, Frank Gore is a baller. For a guy who's going to be 35 years old, as a running back, there's just, how many other 35-year-old running backs are there out there doing anything, much less getting 1,000 yards from scrimmage? He finished up a 3-year, $12 million deal, but I don't blame the Colts for, letting him move on. He's on the last year or two of his career. He signed a 1-year, $1.1 million deal to play back in Miami, which is where he went to college, hometown team. So that's exciting for Frank Gore to end his career likely there in Miami. Dante Moncrief is another guy who is a fairly important player that came up for free agency. You can see that in 2015, he had some big numbers, 733 yards and 6 touchdowns. But last couple of years, he had some injuries. He missed 11 games, in fact, over the last 2 years. So that's something to keep an eye on. If you can't stay on the field, then you can't contribute. So last season he had 391 yards in 12 games, and Jacksonville gave him a 1-year, $9.6 million deal. Very surprising. Very, very surprising. I mean, I guess they wanted someone who was willing to take a short-term deal instead of a long-term deal. So maybe they overpaid for Moncrief. I don't know. But I don't blame the Colts at all for letting him walk. If he stays healthy and plays at his best, yeah, he is like a solid number 2 wide receiver. But those are big ifs. Those are big ifs. So Jacksonville gave him a huge deal. Jack Mewhort was another guy who's a free agent. He's a decent, capable offensive lineman. Was drafted in the second round, finishing up his rookie contract. But last year did not do very well at all. He was struggling with a knee injury. He ultimately landed on IR. And so the Colts brought him back for 1 year and $1.5 million. He's slated to be a backup, and we'll look at some of the other guys they brought in that will likely replace him as a starter. Brandon Williams was a tight end last year that had 122 yards receiving, but he'll be 30 years old this season, and he played on a 1-year, $775,000 deal, basically like a minimum contract. They have not decided to bring him back. Kamar Aiken was another wide receiver. You can see his numbers there. 2015, which is the same year that Moncrief had his huge year for the Colts. Aiken had a huge year for the Ravens that year. 944 yards and 5 touchdowns. Huge year, but the last couple of years has disappointed. Last year with the Colts, had only 133 yards in 15 games, no touchdowns. 28 years old. They paid him $2.6 million. But they are not going to bring him back. He signed a 1-year, $790,000 deal with the Eagles. So he'll be sort of maybe a number 4, number 5 wide receiver, probably number 5 with the Eagles. Who were the defensive players that were hitting free agency for the Colts? Well, the biggest name probably is Rashawn Melvin. He had a very good year. He had signed a 2-year contract that was worth $750,000 per year. And finally had a really big year. And he had been coming off a hand injury, or he will be coming off a hand injury, that landed him on IR late in the season, but he was still able to get a 1-year, $5.5 million deal with the Raiders. So that's interesting. You know, Raiders want to see if he can do it again. You know, if he can have another good year. And the Colts, the Colts have a ton of cap space. Remember that. The Colts could have brought any of these guys back. But they decided that he just wasn't worth $5.5 million a year. And, it'll be interesting to see. If Melvin has a big year with Oakland, that'll end up being a mistake. But if he doesn't, then, obviously it'll be a good decision. But what I'm saying here is, for a cornerback, if you have a great cornerback, $5.5 million, for a number 2 corner, that's very fair money. That's value. That's a deal. But he has to be able to replicate next year what he was able to do last year, and the Colts just decided they weren't sure he could do it. Pierre Desir is another corner that was hitting free agency. He also played well last season. Finished his rookie contract after being drafted out of the 4th round and being picked up off of waivers. So he was actually drafted by another team in the 4th round. They cut him, and the Colts said, "Thank you very much. You know, your trash is our treasure." And it ended up working out well for him. And he'll be returning on a 1-year deal worth $1.75 million. So he's going to have a bit of a raise there from what he was getting paid on his rookie contract. Barkevious Mingo is a linebacker who is a free agent. He improved greatly from his previous seasons and even performed well in coverage, which it's not always easy to find linebackers who, do well in coverage. You can see his numbers there. 47 tackles last year, 2 sacks, 3 forced fumbles, 3 fumble recoveries, 3 tackles for a loss. He did well. He was all over the field, coming off a 1-year, $2 million deal. But he's a former first-round pick. So really, those are not great numbers that you would hope for out of a first-round pick. But they're not bad. Those are decent numbers. And so Seattle decided to give him a 2-year deal worth $6.8 million. Once again, the Colts definitely had the money, but decided not to bring him back. Jonathan Bostic, another linebacker that is going to be, was a free agent this offseason. He had signed a 1-year prove-it deal with the Colts worth $690,000. You can see in 2014, he had a big season with the Bears. Did not do much with New England in 2015, and then didn't even play at all in 2016. So he got a minimum contract last year with the Colts, and he proved it. 97 tackles, 7 tackles for a loss. Not bad for a guy getting, that's phenomenal for a guy getting paid $690,000. And Pittsburgh decided to bring him in to try to compensate for the loss of Ryan Shazier, who was injured in that terrible neck injury, that left him unable to walk for a while. So Jonathan Bostic won't be back with the Colts next year. Darius Butler, a backup safety. He was making $3 million, which is a lot for a guy that wasn't starting. He can still play. He's not washed up necessarily, but he'll be 32 years old next season. The safety market was rough this offseason. Man, there's a lot of, not just Eric Reed, there was Kenny Vaccaro. There was several decent safeties who were not able to find work. Now obviously Reed had the national anthem issue there in San Francisco, but still, there's a couple of guys who were... Trey Boston couldn't find a job until recently when he finally signed a deal with Arizona. I don't know how much they paid him, but there was some really high-quality safeties that still hadn't, found deals that they thought were good enough. And with Butler being 32, I don't know, he might be done. But the Colts drafted T.J. Green in the 2nd round in 2016, and they drafted Malik Hooker in the 1st round in 2017. So it makes sense that Darius Butler wasn't going to be coming back for the Colts. Let's look at all of the major changes that happened. How is the roster going to look different this season than it did last season? Well, for one, Andrew Luck will be back. Don't have to explain to Colts fans. Luck was out last season with that shoulder. That was huge. That really just destroyed the whole season. But it allowed you to get high draft picks, so there's that. And then, think about this. Because you were so terrible last season without Andrew Luck, you were able to get that number 3 pick, which you then parlayed into the number 6 pick plus 3 second-round picks, which really improved your team overall, particularly on the lines. So that ended up in the long term, it's a huge if, but if Andrew Luck can come back healthy, that in the long run is going to do a really huge number for your team to be able to bring some depth. Because actually, the Colts were really terrible across the board last year. They got crushed on both lines, on the offensive line and the defensive line. So it wasn't only that you didn't have Luck. It was way more than that. And so to be able to have some really strong high picks to fill the many, many holes that were on your roster, it might be a small price to pay to have one horrible season, if Andrew Luck can come back healthy. At running back, Frank Gore will be gone, and Matt Jones will be gone. Christine Michael will be coming back. He is a guy who in 2016 had 583 yards and 3.9 yards per carry. Not bad numbers, but then last year he was out with an injury, and then in comes Naheem Hines, who the Colts drafted in the 4th round, as well as Jordan Wilkins, who they drafted in the 5th round. So, they've got a few guys, none of whom, are guaranteed, none of them are Saquon Barkley, right? But these days, you can find quality running backs in the 4th and 5th round. Devontae Freeman was drafted, I think, in the 4th round. You have Alvin Kamara with the Saints that was drafted in the middle rounds. And so you have several guys that you can find in those kind of middle rounds that can crush it. They can be solid stars, really, in the NFL. At wide receiver, Dante Moncrief, I mentioned that. He will not be back. Got that big deal with Jacksonville. Kamar Aiken is also gone. But then, so you can see their numbers at the screen. Moncrief on the top right, and then Aiken on the bottom. Who are they going to replace these two guys with? Their number 2, number 3 wide receiver. Well, they brought in Ryan Grant from the Redskins. They also brought in Shantavius Jones, who's been like a practice squad player most of his career. They brought in James Wright, who's been a kind of a backup reserve wide receiver. And they also drafted Daurice Fountain and Deion Kane in the 5th and 6th round. I don't know if that's going to be good enough to get the job done. They gave, so Moncrief had 1 year at $9.6 million with Jacksonville. The Colts were able to bring in Ryan Grant for 1 year, $5 million. I think that's a better deal. I would probably take Ryan Grant over Moncrief. But then again, look, Ryan Grant only had 1 good year, but it was his last season. That's the thing. What have you done for me lately? And what Ryan Grant has done lately is he had 573 yards and 4 touchdowns. That's not what Moncrief is. So it's a gamble, but Ryan Grant appears to be a guy on the rise. So 1 year, $5 million deal. If he has another good year, you can sign him to a long-term deal. The Colts have a ton of cap space. I like this move, but I don't know if it's enough. I don't know if they've done enough at wide receiver. Let's take a look at tight end. Now, this was a much better improvement. Brandon Williams out, but Eric Ebron in. You can see his numbers there with the Lions. 537 yards in 2015, 711 yards in 2016, 574 yards and 4 touchdowns in 2017. Not bad. That's an improvement. You got a solid tight end there to help out Andrew Luck. So I like that move. That'll definitely improve the offense. Austin Howard is in. He was a starter last season, I believe, for the Ravens. And he will be in to Indianapolis. But the big changes on the offensive line come at guard. Okay? Michael Person, Anthony Fabiano, Adam Redmond, all out. Who's in? Quentin Nelson. That guy, I'll tell you the truth. I'm a big Notre Dame fan, which is, I guess, acceptable to say to most Colts fans, except for those of you that like Purdue. God bless you, little Purdue fans. But for the rest of the Indianapolis Colts fans, I assume it's all right to admit that I'm a lifelong Notre Dame fan. Quentin Nelson is going to be a annual Pro Bowler. Annual Pro Bowler. Unless he has some kind of catastrophic injury. I'm telling this guy, it's size, technique, speed, everything. He is what you want at guard. He was probably the most sure thing in the draft this season. Him and Barkley. You know, I think Quentin Nelson is even more of a sure thing than Barkley. Quentin Nelson is going to be and I'll tell you who the last offensive lineman that was drafted out of Notre Dame that, you know, had sort of similar, not even as high expectations, was the Cowboys drafted a tackle that now is playing guard, and the name, I know it's Zach, but offensive lineman coming out of Notre Dame. These are players who, you know, the best offensive linemen out of Notre Dame can be some of the best offensive linemen in the NFL. And it's not just like a general, oh, this guy went to Notre Dame, so he's going to be, you know, awesome. No. Quentin Nelson has all of the skills that you need. He's got the mind, he's got the body, he's got the technique, he's got it all. So that is really exciting, I think, to know that you've got a guy that is going to protect Andrew Luck. And Zach Martin is the guy I was thinking of. That guy has made the Pro Bowl like every year, even since he was a rookie. Out of Notre Dame, plays for the Cowboys. Braden Smith is another offensive lineman that the Colts drafted. Some people criticized this pick, thought that there were other needs that were bigger needs. But, you know, is there a bigger need than protecting Andrew Luck? I mean, right, if Andrew Luck is protected and he has time to throw, you know, and you guys are able to get yards on the ground running the ball, which will open things up more for Andrew Luck, is there a bigger need than that? I'm not sure. You do have a lot of needs, though, that's for sure. But Braden Smith is a really good pick. That should help solidify the offensive line. And then he also brought in Matt Slauson. And he missed more than half the games in 2017 with a biceps injury, but played very well in 2016 at center. I believe he played for the Chargers. He got a 1-year deal, $2.5 million. He'll probably be that swing interior lineman that can step in at guard or step in at center. He'll be the first man off the bench, maybe there in the middle. So definitely improve the middle of the offensive line. Overall, I'm not sure that we'll see if one of these running backs can get the job done for the Colts. But I'm probably more concerned about what you have at receiver. But offensive line looks great. Andrew Luck is back. Signed a good tight end in Eric Ebram. The offense should be way better in 2018. On the defense, Jonathan Hankins, starter, out. So you can see those numbers there. He spent 1 year in Indianapolis. Had decent numbers. Henry Anderson was the backup. He's also out. Look there at Hankins, $10 million in 2017. It's quite a lot of money. No dead money. They cut him. That was not a guy that but it's because, with the new coach coming in, they're switching to a 4-3 system, and that caused several guys on the defense to be let go because they don't fit the new system. And Hankins is one of those guys. The last 2 years of the deal were scheduled to be for $8.5 million, but they let him go because he's not a system fit anymore. And they had no dead money, so that's good. Henry Anderson was a backup there on the defensive line, 22 tackles with 2 sacks, was a 2015 third-round pick. This was a bit surprising because he was still on his rookie contract. This was going to be the final year of his rookie contract, so he was cheap. He wasn't a guy that was getting paid huge amounts of money, but last season he fractured his larynx. That's not, you hear about guys tearing their ACL, maybe Achilles tear or whatever, but you don't hear about a ton of guys who fracture their larynx, which apparently was very dangerous. Could have died. But they let him go, and he won't be back. Who's in? Who's coming in on the defensive line? Chris McCain was a backup defensive end. I think this was a good pickup by the Colts. It was by far his best season. McCain, 20 tackles and 5 sacks. So he only had 1 super season, but he looked great. 5 sacks, it's not 10, but there aren't a ton of guys, honestly, in the NFL who gets 5 sacks in a year. He had received a right of first refusal tender. It's like an exclusive rights free agent with the Chargers, I believe, but he was accused by a woman of grabbing her by the neck and spitting on her. So, that's not good at all. We'll see how the legal process takes place. If that is true and he did that, at a minimum he should be, and will be, I'm sure, by the NFL, suspended for several games. It's never, ever, ever, ever acceptable to touch a woman, and hurt a woman physically. So, but I'm just saying, on the field, he was great last year. But he denies that it ever happened. Legal process has to take place. I don't typically believe that women usually make up stuff like that up, but occasionally that'll happen, but usually not. So if he is guilty, definitely deserves to be suspended. Maybe deserves to be cut altogether. Never acceptable ever to hit a woman. But he was great on the field. If he's innocent, it's a good pickup. Kamoko Toure, 2nd round pick, and then Tyquan Lewis, another 2nd round pick, will be coming in. So that will really provide some depth and see if one of those guys can maybe really contribute early on. And then also they brought in Karan Reed. At defensive tackle, Joey Mbu is out. He was a backup defensive tackle. They brought in Denico Autry, $7 million in the first year. And the last 2 years are for $5 and $5.8 million. He played with Oakland last year. You can see his numbers there on the right hand of this side of the screen. Very, very good season last year. 36 tackles and 5 sacks. Great numbers, very solid. It's a good pickup for the Colts. Raheem Nunez-Roches, okay? He had 24 tackles last year, 23 tackles the year before, and he will be a Colt. I think the Chiefs let him go, and the Colts picked him up. So that's another good addition. I think that the Colts did a lot of good things on the defensive line. Not necessarily like, oh, they're going to have the best defensive line in the NFL. Obviously not. But they definitely improved their defensive line from last season. Which, my God, they'd have to. At linebacker, Jonathan Bostic out, Barkevious Mingo out. Those are pretty fairly, notable losses. Najee Good is in. I think he played with the Eagles. Darius Leonard, they drafted him in the second round. Tyrell Adams they brought in, but he's mainly a practice squad guy. And then they spent a couple of 7th round picks with Matthew Adams and Zaire Franklin. So, I don't think that the Colts really... But you also have to understand that last year they played 4 linebackers. Their base was a 3-4. This year they only have 3 linebackers in the base defense. So, but I don't think they really necessarily improved dramatically at all at the linebacker position. There's Najee's good numbers, 22 tackles in 16 games as a backup. That's not a bad. Najee Good is a decent pickup. But I think there could be a little drop off there. Rashawn Melvin is out, and Vontae Davis is out. Melvin had one great year before he broke his hand, and Vontae Davis struggled last season. Was trying to play through a groin injury. He said he was a former Pro Bowler, a couple years ago. So at corner, the Colts are bringing back some guys that might be able to really play well at a high level. But obviously they didn't improve at corner. At safety, Darius Butler out. He was getting older. They brought in Shamarko Thomas. But more importantly, Malik Hooker should be back, and he'll be coming off an ACL injury that he suffered in week 7. So, the defense there, the defensive line should be much improved. We'll see what the Colts are able to do this season. With Andrew Luck back, who knows? Maybe anything is possible. They don't have the toughest division, but they don't have the easiest division either. They're not the AFC East, where there's only the Patriots. But, who do they have? They got the Texans. They got Jacksonville. They got Tennessee. So, I don't know. It's not gonna be easy for the Colts, given how many holes they had in their roster last year. But at the same time, they improved both lines. That was the biggest thing they needed to do. Maybe next year, if they can continue to prove at corner, linebacker, wide receiver, maybe running back, they could be right in there. So I definitely think the Colts improved from last year. Should have a much better season this year. Can they make the playoffs? I don't know. It'll be tough. But anything is possible if Andrew Luck is healthy and is back to his old self. So if you like this video, please click subscribe, because we are going to have some of the best coverage of the NFL on YouTube. At the end of the preseason, we are going to break down the rosters of all 32 teams. And then each week, we're going to preview the upcoming week's games. And we're going to actually review in the middle of the week the previous week's games. So make sure to click subscribe, because like I said, we will have some of the best coverage of the NFL on YouTube. Thank you very much.